Thank you, Francois, for inviting me here. This is the book, and like Michael, I'll pass it around so you can kind of contemplate the heft of it, and maybe put it in your Christmas hampers with Matt and Michael's book. I will talk about the motivations that drove me to write the book, which were a little foolhardy now that I look back on it, but it kind of came out of close to 3 decades of involvement in some very low-level political activism. And what I think I started to realise after the 3rd iteration of this low-level political activism is that it was always destined to be low-level political activism because it wasn't really political activism, it was kind of aesthetics. So that's the whole story in a nutshell, and now I'll kind of talk about how it came about, I guess. In the early 1990s, I was kind of young and free, hadn't had my brain infected by intellectualism, and I went out into the world and began to hang around with a lot of anarchists and street protesters and squatters and free party types. And almost automatically I became very uneasy about this idea of opting out of the system, which was very much the kind of the zeitgeist, you know, opting out and squatting, living for free, ohne mich, as the Germans say, you know, you're going to be outside the system as a kind of political statement. And I always felt that was kind of unusual, especially when I was standing in the queue at the Social Security office waiting to pick up my dole check.
Unemployment check.
I just had this feeling, maybe it was a little bit class-based, I don't know, just a kind of uneasiness at this kind of holier-than-thou activism, this kind of pure purity that was sought by so many of my friends and myself. And then I entered university in the late 1990s at the height of empire mania, Hart and Negri, maybe some of you, I mean, they're still around. And I was astonished to find that there were whole intellectual currents that took this stuff seriously, that took this playing around, going to parties and expanding the inner sanctum and whatnot, you know, that this was actually taken seriously. This was actually like theorised about. I thought, wow, I thought it was just youthful exuberance or something. So I was becoming deeply troubled because a lot of the goals that were pursued by myself and my friends I took to be normatively desirable. Equality, women's rights, and, you know, anti-imperialism and all those kind of left things. And then I was confronted by the anti-corporate globalisation movement, the battle for Seattle and Genoa and all of these things. And I went to the World Social Forum as a research assistant. I kind of was involved again, and it was like what I've come since I've been in this country, the Yogi Berra effect. You know, it was deja vu all over again. It was kind of the same thing happening again. A lot of posturing, a lot of prefigurative action, a lot of veganism and whatnot, and not much change. You know, I embarked on my dissertation, which was political theory, theories of individualism. Had very little to do with this book, which was building in me, which I didn't know was building in me at the time. But, you know, I was then confronted by the 2008 global financial crisis, the Occupy movement, and again, the Yogi Berra came into my head. Deja vu all over again once more, but with mobile phones this time. It was very clear that something was very, very wrong maybe not, very, wrong with the whole idea that prefiguring in the here and now the kind of good or right world that one wants is politically significant or effective. I became very, very exercised by the fact that it was completely ineffective and completely insignificant. So I began to think about these issues in relation to the environmental movement, and I became immersed in the literature on green citizenship, environmental citizenship, ecological citizenship, and I noticed that a similar kind of ambience affected the green citizenship literature, the prioritising of individual agency over collective action, of moral choice over political change, of free private decision over legislative constraint or facilitation, and most importantly, the prioritisation of a kind of worldview that understood the whole as if it were the linear sum of individuals' green moral choices, the aggregate kind of sum. And it began to look to me very much like a benign, holistic mirror image of the neoliberalism that everybody was railing against. It was kind of like the benign mirror image of the malignant neoliberal idea. And that's what I argued in my first book. And a lot of people liked it, a lot more people didn't like it. When I say a lot, that's relative to the 2 dozen people who read it. And then I came to Virginia Tech. And the pressure to trace out this intellectual current became too strong. And to the students in the room, I would say that if you feel that pressure, maybe don't obey it, because I think it was a foolhardy move, because the book is a little bit polemic rather than dispassionate. But that's life. You have to do what's inside you, what comes out. I began to trace the intellectual lineage of the broader ideas that seem to inform all of these things that I'd been involved in my youth, all of these things that I saw from my armchair with Occupy. I began to trace the kind of intellectual roots, the currents that were informing, if you like, and being informed by these activist scholars. I didn't start from nowhere. I had some clues to begin with, some places to start from. My dissertation chair was asked to review a copy of Hartman Negri's Empire. His name is Tom Nairn, maybe you know. And he just went into a funk about it. And he started mumbling about Spinoza. And I read his review, and it started to speak to me. And when I came here, I reread his review with a copy of Commonwealth or Multitude or whatever it is in my hand. And I started to understand why he went into a funk as an old lefty, why he went into a funk about Spinoza. It started to speak to me, things started to kind of come together, and then I read Tim's work on the early environmental movement and the artificial negativity thesis and whatnot, and thought, okay, now the picture's starting to come together. So I sketched out the plan for the book, and much as Matt did, I was at a conference and I spoke to an editor. He was quite excited about it, and I thought, well, the offer is there, I should take the offer for the contract and get the book out, because I kind of needed to for instrumental reasons. So I started on the book. I found that there did exist a radical political as opposed to a radical moral or philosophical movement that had for a long time sought to call attention to the follies of what I'm going to call moralism, of moralising about political questions, because morality has its place and it's very important and it's very productive for scholars who for scholars who are aware that they are working in the moral realm. But what I started to understand was that there was some kind of category error going on amongst many political thinkers, political theorists. They were mistaking moral philosophy for political theory. So there was a category error there. And moralism was defined as the idea that the social world can be made to conform to some eternal truth, reason, beauty, the good or the right, some kind of eternal idea. Fortunately for me, serendipitously for me, this political theoretical movement was having a resurgence in the first decade and in the 2010s under the banner of the realist debates in political theory. So I was able to tap into these debates. Although I'm very sceptical, about some of the more overblown claims for political realism and some of the people who have attached themselves to it, such as William Galston, who some of you may know as Bill Clinton's philosopher and in-house philosopher. I found the work of other contributors to this, these realist debates very compelling, Raymond Goyce, Bernard Williams, and very useful, because they were aware and they were trying to make scholars aware of the subdisciplinary distinction between moral philosophy and political theory, and they were calling upon scholars to stop asking political theory to do the work of moral philosophy. They argue that the two are separate and they should be seen as separate enterprises. A lot of the realist stuff is kind of rebarbative and very kind of aggressive and descended into kind of sophomoric debates in some journals like European Journal of Political Theory and European Journal of Social Theory to some extent. But you can take from it a kind of distinction. And moral philosophy grows from Plato and Aristotle, as the realists see it, and takes in Spinoza, Kant, Locke, Bentham, Mill, as well as the right Hegelians and Nietzsche, therefore Heidegger, but also Rawls, Nozick and Habermas. So it's a way of seeing people who are usually discussed very, very separately as being in one camp. The driving idea of the moralists is to treat problems as tractable through the application of some eternal Platonic form or ideal, or alternatively to follow Aristotle and draw some ultimate principle from the observation of natural forces. So your theory expresses nature, or your theory applies reason to nature. For the realists, for Goyce and Williams, political theory, on the other hand, does something different, and it's closely related to history in some ways. Stems from Herodotus and Thucydides, through Machiavelli, Hobbes, Holbach, the left Hegelians, Marx, and left Nietzscheans, Freud, Weber, Adorno, and some have put Foucault into that camp, but I don't really know very much about Foucault. So essentially, I structure the book around this tripart distinction between two kinds of moralising and political theorising. The first kind of moralising is a top-down, authoritarian kind of moralising, which gains expression today in Peter Singer's utilitarianism, ideologically in rational choice theory or neoliberalism. The task is to reform individuals in the image of some pure rational authority. Okay? The second kind of moralising, which is more interesting to me, okay, is a bottom-up kind of moralising, and it's like a negative reflection of, it's the benign reflection of the first kind. And we see that in Rawls, Habermas, and more recent iterations of Frankfurt critical theory, Rainer Forst. The task is to specify the right and hold it up as the definitive constraint on power, even if you have no power to constrain. Okay? Political theory is doing something completely different to those two laudable tasks. Okay? Political theory, as I understand it, and this is where Adorno in particular becomes very helpful, even though his isn't in any way a political theory. Adorno becomes very helpful here because what is important about his work is that he explicitly recognised that he did not do moral philosophy. His is a negative enterprise. He helps us to see the problems associated with efforts to bring a moral philosophy to bear on the social world, as if it were a political theory. In the words of realists such as Goyce and Williams, as if it were a political theory. What this reading of Adorno shows is that if one is to bring a moral philosophy to bear in the real world, one faces a choice. One must either run with power, with the big guns and the wallets, you know, or one must indulge in a kind of aestheticism, where you hold up pure reason as something that you should attune yourself to, or that authority should follow. And both of these are fine. A lot of knowledge can be gained by equating reason with power, as do utilitarians, or with beauty, as do the Spinozas, such as Hart and Negri, or their forebears, Deleuze and Guattari, or the more recent new vitalists and new materialists and whatnot. So to kind of conclude it all and round it all down, the upshot of all of this is that the kinds of prefigurative, personalist, political, sub-political, anarchist, you know, stuff that I was into when I was younger, was simply an aestheticism that mistook itself for a political, for anything political. It was merely a kind of moral a way of being moral, a moralising approach to the world. And what I came to realise, and what I argue in the book really, is that while I was swanning around the planet carrying on like that for a decade or more, and while my younger people are still doing the same thing, I believe, those who adopted the kind of authoritarian view got on with running the world, and with trying to shape individuals in the image of pure rational authority, the market chooser, consumer. Yeah, that's it. That's the argument of the book in a nutshell, and that's the conclusion I came to. At the moment, I'm thinking of the next project, which tries to bring this I'm trying to bring this framework to understand what everybody else is trying to understand at the moment, which is the populist, demagogic kind of post-political, post-truth, and unfortunately post-environmental world that we're in.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.